And opening statements got underway today in the Hollywood overdose murder trial. Hollywood producer David Pearce and actor Brandt Osborn are charged in the deaths of 2 women back in November of 2021.
Prosecutors say Hilda Cabrales and Christy Giles were drugged and later dumped. Crime and Justice correspondent Matt Johnson joins us now with a debrief. Matt?
Yes, good evening. Powerful opening statements in the Hollywood overdose murder trial playing out there in Los Angeles.
Jane Doe 1. And she met the defendant at around 19 years old through an ex-boyfriend at the time. So she showed up to the defendant's house, and when she got there, she was surprised. Nobody else was there. And while she was there, the defendant offered her a drink to wait to have and consume until other people got there so they could then go to the club. Jane Doe 1 kindly accepted the drink the defendant gave her, and she started to immediately feel sick. The next thing you know, she blacks out, and the next thing she remembers is waking up on the edge of the defendant's bed with a defendant raping her.
Disgraced Hollywood producer David Pearce listened closely as prosecutors called him a sexual predator who had been assaulting women for more than a decade. Pearce and his co-defendant, actor Brandt Osborn, on trial for the deaths of 2 women. Model Christy Giles and her architect friend, Hilda Cabrales, died in 2021. Their bodies dumped at area hospitals in Los Angeles by 3 men wearing masks. Prosecutors told the jury that Pearce and Osborn didn't call for help because, quote, dead girls don't talk. Defense attorneys told the jury the victims consumed drugs on their own, which led to their demise.
Would respectfully request you take very good notes with respect to, because you have pencil and paper. And here goes. Mr. Pearce and Mr. Ansbach and Mr. Osborn met Ms. Giles and Ms. Cabrales at a rave, R-A-V-E, or a nightclub, somewhere in downtown LA. Raves have been ongoing since I was a teenager, and they still are. A warehouse party. It's going to be proven by the prosecutor that Ms. Giles and Ms. Cabrales, before they even met Mr. Pearce, who incidentally they met at that rave party, okay? They were ingesting alcohol, like everyone, smoking weed, presumably like everyone, but also snorting cocaine and ketamine.
My client, Mr. Osborn, is charged with being an accessory after the fact to these charged murders. And with respect to Mr. Osborn, the prosecution will show beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Osborn knew that Mr. Pearce gave these 2 young women drugs that killed them. And you will see it during the trial that that's simply not the case. That he did not know even that Mr. Pearce gave them any drugs, if in fact he did.
Before opening statements even started this morning, attorneys signaled other Hollywood scandals could be brought up during the course of this trial during testimony, including big names like Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, and Sean Diddy Combs. That's the very latest on this story. In studio, Matt Johnson, Court TV.
All right, Matt, thank you so much. Court TV is only allowed to bring you opening statements and closing arguments in this particular trial.
So we want to bring you the opening statements now in its entirety. We're going to begin first with the prosecution.
We're going to hear about from Ms. Jane Doe 1. And she met the defendant at around 19 years old through an ex-boyfriend at the time. Now, when I talk about Jane Doe and a corresponding number in this case, I'm talking about the charged victims in this case. Now, I'm not referring to them as a Jane Doe and a corresponding number because I want to be impersonal or insensitive. I just want to let you guys know that the reason why I'm using Jane Doe and a corresponding number for the charged victims in this case is to ensure their security as well as to ensure their privacy throughout the criminal justice system process. Now, that being said, I want to talk to you about the incident with Jane Doe 1. Like I had said, she was 19 years old at the time, very young. And she met the defendant through an ex-boyfriend, and they would go out together, go to clubs, go out to events, things like that. On one particular night, she made plans with the defendant and other people to go out to a club that night, go out to a bar. So she showed up to the defendant's house, and when she got there, she was surprised. Nobody else was there. It was just her alone with the defendant. Now, she was weirded out by this situation, but she just went with it anyway. She just rolled with the situation. And while she was there, the defendant offered her a drink to wait to have and consume until other people got there so they could then go to the club. Jane Doe 1 kindly accepted the drink the defendant gave her, and she started to immediately feel sick, feel dizzy, like the room was spinning, so she went to the bathroom. The next thing you know, she blacks out, and the next thing she remembers is waking up on the edge of the defendant's bed with the defendant raping her. That is, thrusting his penis repeatedly into her vagina as she laid on the edge of the defendant's bed. Despite her resistance, despite her protest from the defendant, against the defendant doing that to her, she again blacks out. The next thing you know, she wakes up in the bathroom with the defendant yelling at her, cursing at her, and she again blacks out. When she finally wakes up, she's disoriented. She doesn't know how, but she finally gets out of the defendant's apartment and makes her way home. Now, when she wakes up and realizes how the defendant had taken advantage of her, she was so overwhelmed with shame, so overwhelmed by the incident and the horror of it, that she attempted to also take her own life. Now, I want to talk to you about Jane Doe number 2. Jane Doe number 2 is someone else you're also going to hear from during this case. Now, she was about 25 years old in 2010 of August, and she was a Loyola law student. And during that time frame, she was looking for a room to rent as a law student. So she posted an ad in Craigslist. And in response to her ad, she received a reply from this email address, Billy Clyde. So she went to the apartment, 8641 West Olympic Boulevard, that's depicted here, to check out this room rent. And that's where she met with the defendant, who was accompanied by another female at the time. Now, as the defendant was giving her a tour of his apartment and the room that was available for rent, keep in mind that he was trying to be really impressive. He was talking about all the industry professionals he knew. He was dressed in a black suit, wearing jewelry, looking very gaudy with earrings in his ears and so forth. Now, as he continued to give her a tour, he offered her a drink. And again, Jane Doe 2, like Jane Doe 1, kindly accepted the offer. Soon thereafter, she passes out. The next thing you know, Jane Doe 2 also wakes up on the defendant's bed, and this time she sees that female orally copulating her. She then feels pain to her vaginal area, and she looks down and she sees that the defendant is inserting a wine bottle into her vagina. She immediately panics, pushes the female away from her, and attempts to push the defendant away from her as well. In reaction, the defendant takes Jane Doe, throws her to the ground, and punches her. Disoriented, Jane Doe tries to run out of the defendant's room, tries to grab her belongings, and tries to get out the door. Before she can get out the door, the defendant grabs her, flinging her phone across the room, causing it to shatter. Nonetheless, Jane Doe 2 finally makes it out of that apartment and gets home. Now, you're also going to hear from Jane Doe 2 that she didn't report this incident to law enforcement until she heard about the deaths of Christy, Giles and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola. Now, I'll talk more in a bit about the deaths of Christy, Giles and Hilda Cabrales at the hands of the defendant. But what I want to talk to you about now is that Jane Doe 2 will come here and tell you she did not report this incident until hearing about those deaths in the news. And she's going to talk to you about how difficult it was for her back then to even attempt to try and report this incident, to put herself out there as a young woman and talk publicly about suffering from a sexual assault. But she's also going to tell you that when she heard about the deaths of Christy, Giles, and Hilda in the news, she felt obligated, felt that it was necessary to finally come forward, help Christy and Hilda's families achieve justice, and finally tell her story. Now, what I'm telling you about Jane Doe 2's disclosure is something that you're going to hear about with a lot of the victims in this case. You're going to hear about how they didn't report their victimization for quite some time, but that when they heard about the deaths of Christy and Hilda, they too felt a certain way, felt that it was necessary for them to come forward and finally tell their story as well. And they'll talk to you about the difficulties of having to talk about one of the most traumatic, if not the most traumatic experience of their life when they come in here and talk to you about it in full. You're also going to hear from another woman, and her name is, well, she's Jane Doe number 3. She was 32 years old at the time when she was here in the United States from New Zealand. She was here on a 3-month holiday. Now, she wanted to remain in the United States legally and gain employment. So she joined an app called BumbleBiz to connect with professionals in the area. When she was on this app, that's how she connected with the defendant, who posed as a CEO. When she connected with the defendant, she decided to meet him, and they met at a fancy steakhouse in Beverly Hills. While at this dinner at the steakhouse, he talked again about how he was well connected in the industry. He introduced one of his friends who was there, even as Eddie Murphy's son. During this dinner, he talked about how he could get her employment and get her legal status in the country so she could remain in Los Angeles, which is what her ultimate goal was. After that dinner, they went back to the defendant's apartment so that they could have this quote-unquote special drink prior to going out to a trendy Hollywood nightclub. So they go back to his apartment. Jane Doe 3 ingests or consumes this special alcoholic drink, and then they go out to this trendy Hollywood club and an after party. Now, when they get back to the house, the defendant insists that Jane Doe 3 go back to his house. He gives her a tour of his apartment, including her room. When they're in there, he tells her to lay down on the bed. But Jane Doe 3 is explicit in not wanting to engage in any sort of sexual relations with the defendant at this time. She's explicit about it. But the defendant doesn't care. He pushes her onto the bed and forces himself on her, rips her panties down, places her legs over his shoulders, inserts his penis into her vagina, and rapes her. He does this as she continues to cry in pain and in agony, and consistently tells him to stop. Despite her protest both physically and verbally, the defendant continues to thrust his penis into her vagina.
All right, and the prosecution, Michael, is in this opening going to have to establish through evidence that these two drugged and the women and killed them because of drugging them, and the cause of death was directly due to them, and they're therefore guilty.
Only one of them.
One of them, that's right.
Only one of them,
Osborn
right? Pierce. Osborn has accessory after the fact.
That's
but they still have to show that he knew that Pierce drugged them in order for him to get convicted of that charge when he was helping them dump them at the hospital.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of evidence they have to produce in this case. We're going to hit the pause button. Up next, we'll take you back in for opening statements. The prosecutor continues to lay out its case to the jury. Keep it here on your front row seat to justice.
Tonight on closing arguments, she was 12 years old when she stabbed her classmate. Now she's seeking release. We have the latest from today's hearing in the Slenderman stabbing case.
Closing arguments tonight at 8/7 Central, only on Court TV.
JonBenet is God.
A 2-night special report.
Exclusive video of the man who claims to be JonBenet Ramsey's killer.
Fanny Politan investigates. Tonight, 9/8 Central, only on Court TV.
Before we head back to court, let's bring in National Trial Attorney Michael Jafer. Michael, first of all, thank you as always for joining us both here. But second of all, how do you feel like this is for defense? Basically, it's a cause of death defense, saying it's not our fault that they died. We didn't kill anybody. What do you think?
For the defense, I think it's going to be, I think the defense have a lot of options here, tons of options. I think, so, you know, Judge, actually, I'm upset that the court is not letting us watch this trial because this is the most complicated type of trial. We always talk about law school exam questions. This is the most complicated type of trial to handle, right? The most difficult for the prosecutor, difficult for the defense, because you have, you know, you have two murder victims. You're the prosecution. You have to defend. You have to prove that both of these girls who have completely different, distinct biologies and fact patterns were killed. So the defense have tons of options here. We already know from their opening statement that they're going to come in there and say, well, these girls, they were already taking their own drugs. Those are the defense attorneys for Pearce. And for Osborn, he has even more defenses. So I think this is going to be very complicated for the defense because at the end of the day, who killed them? How were they killed, right? You can't prove that my client gave them the drugs. They were already taking ketamine. They were already taking cocaine. They already had fentanyl in their system. This was the first time that they met them. Why are you assuming that my client gave them the killing drugs? So I think they have a whole buffet of options, and I'm really upset we don't get to see this trial because honestly, I could learn a ton by watching this trial. I've been practicing for 20 years. If I could watch this entire trial, I'd learn something every other minute. So, you know, it's kind of, you know, frustrating that we don't get to see the whole entire trial and only the openings. Even the openings, I've learned a couple of things.
And Mike, you know, you talked about how they're going to show that, in fact, he gave them the drugs that ended up killing them or he drugged them at all. Well, I want to talk about some of the evidence the state is going to be allowed to bring in, Mike. They're bringing in 6 other victims that alleging, now he's not been convicted of these crimes, they're working their way through the system where he allegedly drugged and raped these women. They're coming forward, they're going to tell their story in this trial before we even get to the facts of this case. That's pretty devastating and prejudicial stuff. I would imagine when you do the balancing test, I guess they thought it was very probative.
I can't believe that they allowed that in. To be honest with you, I don't think it should have been in because at the end of the day, one has nothing to do with the other, even if you take as an assumption of fact that he drugged 20 other people, right? Obviously, it doesn't look good where there's smoke, there's fire. But even if you take as an assumption of fact he drugged 20 other people, what if he didn't drug these girls, right? If there's going to be a conviction, as a citizen, I would want that conviction to be realistic. At the end of the day, these girls were not exactly blameless in their own health because they were also taking ketamine and cocaine before they even met this villain. The prosecution is going to paint this person as a villain. Honestly, with what you just said, Michael, I don't think it's going to be hard. I think the jury is going to come into this trial with an open mind. And I think when this stuff is introduced, he will be painted as a villain. I don't think the judge should have allowed it. I honestly don't think it's relevant to this particular crime. The judge obviously disagreed with me. They looked at the evidence more closely. But at the end of the day, if you're his defense attorney, it's going to be extremely difficult to cleanse the juror's mind from that. Because I already think he's guilty. If I see that and he did this to 6 other people, then what are we even talking about? So
that's the problem.
That's what I think.
And I also think the defense is really going to go after the victims and try to do it in a way that doesn't offend the jury, but at least paints them in a bad light because they were doing a lot of different drugs. I just wanted to mention a reminder for our viewers that California is a state in which the court has the discretion to determine whether or not cameras are allowed, and we are only allowed to bring the openings and closing in this particular case.
Yeah, we've been in this situation before with California. All right, Mike, stand by. We're going to head back to court now, where the prosecutor is still presenting her opening statement in the Hollywood overdose murder trial.
About the situation, drinks some of this wine, and again, passes out. When she wakes up, she finds that the defendant, again, has returned from being out at this party, and she's confused, disoriented, and finally decides to leave the apartment. Now, you're going to also hear from J. Doe number 4. Now, she may have some difficulties in getting through her testimonies. Many of the victims in this case will as well. But she's going to get through it. She's going to come in here and she's going to talk to you about how she went to the defendant's apartment with a friend for a party. And when she got there, the defendant offered her a drink. Like the other women in this case, she kindly took the drink and she immediately passes out. At this point, she wakes up on the couch in the defendant's apartment and she feels pain to her vaginal area and sees that the defendant's hand is inside her vagina. She tries to push the defendant away as a result of what she's feeling and what she sees, but the defendant grabs her wrist, holds her down, and continues to penetrate her vagina with his hand, leaving injuries to her wrist. She manages to finally fight the defendant away and runs out of the apartment and makes her way home and passes out. When she wakes up, she finds vulgar text messages from the defendant as well. You're also going to hear from Jane Doe 5. She was very young at the time. She was 19 years old and a student at the University of Redlands during this time frame. And she met the defendant on Tinder, a dating application, where the defendant posed as a CEO again, lying about his age as being only 30 years old. During this time frame, they engage in conversation initially on the application, and those communications turn to text messages and phone calls for about a week before she agrees to meet up with him. The plan is for her to come down for the weekend to the defendant's apartment where they would go out, and then the next day go to a Super Bowl party. Keeping that in mind, the victim goes down to the defendant's apartment, and after having talked for about a week and exchanging communication, she felt pretty comfortable. They started hanging out, and they decided to engage in consensual sex. After doing that, they get prepared to go out to a bunch of Hollywood clubs and bars, and she consumes 2 drinks at the apartment. Her, the defendant, and some friends then go to a club in the Hollywood area where her memory starts to get pretty fuzzy. She starts to lose much of her memory of the night. They continue to an after party, and that's her last memory. Her next clear memory is then waking up at 1 p.m. the next day in the defendant's bed, and she asks the defendant, not knowing what happened, exactly what happened the night before, and asks him what happened last night. He tells her, well, you took shrooms, you took cocaine, and we had sex again. Now, by this point, Jane Doe 5 has zero memory of either taking drugs or having sex with the defendant again. Concerned and uncomfortable with this entire situation, she goes with the defendant to the Super Bowl party, but she feels the effects of whatever was in those drinks from the night before. She's so uncomfortable that she tells her friends via text message, other students from Redlands, about how she was feeling. Realizing that Jane Doe 5 was in trouble, her friends take a ride share all the way from Redlands, all the way to Venice, where that Super Bowl party was, to pick up the victim. Jane Doe 5 then returns to the University of Redlands, goes to the hospital, receives a rape kit or SART examination, and reports this incident to the police. Jane Doe 6 is another woman that the defendant met on the dating app Bumble. And she's an aspiring singer. And the defendant told her that he could help her out with her music career because she, in fact, was a music talent manager. Now, like Jane Doe number 5, they engaged in conversation in the app. It evolved to text messages, and they were talking dating. She believed that this was the beginning of a dating relationship, and they finally decided to meet up at the defendant's apartment. When they get to the apartment, they're hanging out, and they do engage in making out, and they engage in consensual oral sex together. Now, they continue to hang out throughout the night, and at this point, Jane Doe 6 ingests drugs as well as alcohol with the defendant. And soon thereafter, she too blacks out. When she wakes up, she finds herself face down on the defendant's bed with the defendant thrusting his penis into her anus. Now, she tries to fight him off, but she finds herself or her body to be so weak that she cannot resist what the defendant is doing to her. In fact, she can only find enough strength to grip the sheets of the bed in front of her, causing her nails to break. Now, despite this incident, Jane Doe 6 does see the defendant again. She's unsure of what happened.
Victim after victim, she's explaining it to this jury. It's devastating and powerful evidence.
It is.
All right, we're going to take a break here, folks. More from the state as the prosecutor continues to lay out her case to the jury in the case against Hollywood producer David Pearce and actor Brandt Osborn. Keep it here on Court TV.
back to Court TV Live. I'm Ashley Wilcott.
And I'm Michael Ayala. We're continuing our coverage in the Hollywood overdose murder trial. Hollywood producer David Pearce and actor Brandt Osborn are charged in connection with the deaths of 2 women back in November of 2021.
Christy, Giles, and Hilda Cabrales both died of drug overdoses after their bodies were left outside separate hospitals in 2021. David Pearce is charged with their murders as well as rape and sexual assault. Now, Brandt Osborn, the actor, is charged with being an accessory after the fact.
Now, we're only allowed to bring you opening statements and closing arguments in this particular trial. California has that right to keep cameras out, but they gave us the openings and closings in this case. So let's get you back into court for more of the state's opening statement.
She decides to give the defendant another chance. But despite this, the defendant continues to harass Jane Doe 6, being mean towards her, and act in a vulgar way, causing her to finally distance herself from the defendant. You also have Jane Doe number 7. Now, she met the defendant at a Halloween party in the Hollywood Hills. And when she was leaving the party, she left the party with the defendant under the guise of getting a ride home from the defendant. And instead of taking her home, they end up at the defendant's apartment. They're in the living room, sitting on the couch, and the defendant makes some advances towards her. Initially, Jane Doe 7's okay with this. They're kissing, and she thinks it's okay. But the defendant all of a sudden starts to insult her. Insult her looks, insult her body, insult her breasts. And at that point, Jane Doe 7 wants nothing to do with the defendant and tries to leave. In her attempt to leave, the defendant grabs her wrist, holds her down, and then proceeds to rape her on that couch by inserting his penis into her vagina, causing her injuries. Now, after the incident, he then tells her to please apologize to his roommate, defendant Osborn, for taking too much noise. He then threatens to harm her family who lives in Oklahoma by reciting their address from the ID that he took from her belongings. In addition to that, he even films her as some sort of blackmail in order to prevent her from reporting it to police or from suing him. Now, in addition to these women, Jane Doe's 1 through 7 that you'll hear in regards to their individual experiences regarding the sexual assault the defendant committed against them, you're also going to have an opportunity to hear from other victims, other women who have suffered from the same plight as Jane Doe's 1 through 7. Now, in addition to these people, Carrie L. being one of them in 2005, Sarah S. in 2007, Maury M. in the fall of 2007, Susanna L. in 2017, and Jacqueline D. in 2017. In addition to Jane Doe's 1 through 7, you will also hear from these women. Yes, they will also testify to similar experiences as Jane Doe's 1 through 7. That is, that the defendant provided them with drugs and or alcohol, incapacitated them, and took advantage of them, whether it be through the use of drugs or through the use of violence. And these women's testimony not only go to show the defendant's violent tendencies and sexual habits, but they also go to show that Jane Doe's 1 through 7 are in fact telling the truth about what happened to them at the hands of the defendant. Now, it's this heinous, this predatory behavior that I've just talked to you about with all of these women that ultimately lead to the deaths of Christy Giles on the left and Hilda Cabrales-Arzola on the right. Now, on November 13th of 2021, Christy and Hilda are at a rave party or warehouse party in the East LA area, and they encounter defendant Pearce on the left, defendant Osborn in the middle, and Michael Ansbach in the VIP area of this party. They meet, they hang out for a couple of hours before Christy and Hilda decide to go back to the apartment of the defendants, defendant Pearce and defendant Osborn, at the 8641 Olympic Boulevard address. This is them hanging out in the VIP area and before deciding to go back to their apartment. When they arrive by way of defendant Osborn driving them back to their apartment. And they arrive at 5:11 a.m. We'll hear from Michael Onsbach that once they get back to the apartment, Christy and Hilda, Michael Onsbach, and the defendant are hanging out in his media room in his apartment. And defendant Pearce provides Christy, Giles, Hilda Cabrales, as well as Michael Onsbach with alcoholic beverages and cocaine. You'll hear that, yes, Christy and Hilda, before getting to the warehouse party, before getting to the defendant's apartment, that they were out with friends prior and were earlier ingesting alcohol and other drugs. But you'll hear that the alcoholic beverages provided to Onsbach, Christy, and Hilda had GHB in it, also known as a date rape drug. You'll also hear that the cocaine that defendant Pearce provided to Onsbach and these two young women also had fentanyl in it. And you'll hear that they drank those drinks and ingested that cocaine. And that despite Christy and Hilda having done drugs earlier that night, it is the defendant giving them or furnishing those drugs to Christy and Hilda that ultimately killed them. Now, Michael Onsbach is going to say a number of things. Right? He's going to talk to you about what happened in that apartment, specifically that those two women, Christy and Hilda, ingested cocaine that was given to them by the defendant that had fentanyl in it. But it'll become very clear that soon after getting into that apartment, those two girls become extremely uncomfortable. And we know this based on text messages they exchanged. And keep in mind, these two women are sitting right next to each other in this apartment, as can be seen from this photograph. Christy's there laying on the left, and Hilda's on the right. Despite sitting next to each other, they exchanged text messages. From Christy to Hilda at 5:30 in the morning, that's about 20 minutes after first arriving, Christy says, let's go, with what I would call a shocking emoji. An emoji that you wouldn't want your friend to send to you as an indication of some sort of trouble or being creeped out or something like that. In response, Hilda says, yes, I'll call an Uber 10 minutes away. So you know at this point.
All right, we do need to step aside. When we return, the state will wrap up its opening statement. She's detailing a lot of evidence they're planning to present against these two. Stay with us here on Court TV Live.
Tonight on Closing Arguments, she was 12 years old when she stabbed her classmate. Now she's seeking release. We have the latest from today's hearing in the Slenderman stabbing case.
Closing Arguments, tonight at 8/7 Central, only on Court TV.
JonBenet is God.
A two-night special report.
Exclusive video of the man who claims to be JonBenet Ramsey's killer.
Vinnie Politan investigates. Tonight, 9/8 Central, only on Court TV.
Wrapping up the state's opening statement in the Hollywood overdose murder trial of David Pearce and Brandt Osborn. Let's get you back inside the courtroom.
They want to leave. And an Uber does in fact arrive at 5:44 a.m., but no one comes out to get inside that Uber. And it leaves about 5 minutes later at 5:49 a.m. In fact, the next time Hilda and Christy are seen leaving that apartment is when defendant Pearce and defendant Osborn are carrying their limp bodies outside of that apartment. This is at 4:30 p.m. on the left, when defendant Pearce is carrying Christy's, again, limp body down the stairs of his apartment. That's about 11 hours after they first arrived. On the right, defendant Pearce and Osborn behind him again are carrying Hilda's limp body down the stairs of their apartment at 6:47 p.m., about 13 hours after first arriving. Now you're going to hear that at the late morning hours of November 13th, 2021, around 11:30 or around noontime, you'll hear that Brandt Osborn had come back home from getting a COVID test. Now when he arrived home, they discovered, him and defendant Pearce discovered that Christy Giles at this point had no pulse and was not breathing. And that Hilda Cabrales only had a faint pulse. But instead of calling 911, instead of calling for help, instead of calling anybody, they decided to wait. They decided to wait, and wait some more. And that's because you'll hear that Pearce said to defendant Osborn at this time, dead girls don't talk. So they waited and waited that 11 and 13 hours on purpose. And that's because, again, dead girls don't talk. Now, when they finally decide to take Christy to the hospital at 4:30 p.m., they carry her limp body down the stairs, put her into the defendant's black Prius with the license plates purposefully taken off, and they drop her off at Southern California Hospital. And that's where they're being wheeled into the emergency room. And they tell hospital personnel there that they just merely found her in that condition and were merely being good Samaritans by dropping her off at the hospital. And keep in mind, when they decide to take her to the hospital, they take her to Southern California Hospital, which is 3 miles away from the 8641 West Olympic address, which is circled on that map. The closest hospital to them is in fact Cedars-Sinai, which is only about a mile away, which is the square at the north of this map. But they purposefully take Christy to a hospital that's farther away. They then return back to the apartment and they wait about an hour and a half before then taking Hilda to the hospital. And this is Hilda at Kaiser Hospital when they drop her off in the emergency room. And where do they decide to take Hilda? Like I said, they take her to Kaiser, which is about 2 miles away from their apartment. Again, purposefully choosing a different hospital from the one that they dropped off Christy at. And again, a hospital farther away than the closest hospital to them, which is Cedars-Sinai. Now, what do they do after dropping these two women 2 hours apart from each other, dead upon arrival? Right? They don't get help. They don't call the police. They don't tell anybody about what happened. What defendant Osborn and defendant Pearce decide to do is they decide to cover their tracks. When defendant Pearce and defendant Osborn get home, they strip the bed that Hilda was sleeping in and wash the sheets. She was sleeping in their roommate's bed who was recently out of town, and they wash the sheets. In addition to that, they take Hilda's phone, they turn it off, and they get rid of it so that law enforcement cannot find it. There's drugs in the house. They also get rid of those so that law enforcement cannot find them as well. Now, defendant Pearce goes even a step further. He decides to research non-extradition countries and how it's like to live in another country. And we know that because his search history on his cell phone shows searches for non-extradition countries and how to live in places like Ukraine. In addition to that, upon his arrest, $30,000 and a passport was also found in his car. Defendant Pearce was ready to leave the country and evade prosecution. That is not something an innocent person would do. Now, during this trial, the evidence will definitely establish that defendant Pearce sexually assaulted all of the Jane Does in this case, the prior women who I showed you, as well as Christy and Hilda. It will also show, or the trial will also establish that defendant Osborn helped him get rid of any evidence to implicate defendant Pearce in the deaths of Christy and Hilda. The evidence will show that the defendant knowingly gave Hilda and Christy GHB and fentanyl, knowing that it was dangerous to their lives, knowing that it could kill them, but he just didn't care. He didn't care whether they lived or died. All he cared about was taking advantage of that. And that's exactly what he did.